It was a chilly afternoon in the heart of the city. The streets were busy with people rushing to work, running errands, or meeting friends. The air smelled of coffee, fresh bread from a nearby bakery, and the faint scent of car exhaust mixed with the cold breeze. Most people were focused on their own lives, their faces buried in their phones or lost in thoughts about their day. But among the crowd, there was one figure who looked completely out of place. He was a homeless man, wearing layers of worn-out clothes that barely protected him from the cold. His shoes were torn, and his hands were rough and cracked from years of living on the streets. He walked slowly, almost aimlessly, stopping from time to time to look around. Despite his situation, there was something in his eyes that drew attention, a quiet strength, a spark of hope that seemed impossible to ignore. The man's name was not important to most people. To the busy crowd, he was just another face, someone to ignore as they hurried past. But today, something was different. Today, he felt drawn to a piano that sat near the corner of the train station. It was a public piano, polished and inviting, placed there for anyone who wished to play. People often walked by without noticing it, but the man stopped and stood in front of it. He touched the keys lightly with his fingers, hesitant at first, unsure if he had the courage to play in front of strangers. The keys felt familiar under his touch, and a memory from long ago flashed in his mind. He had played piano before, many years ago, in a different life, when things were simpler. That memory brought a faint smile to his face, and he pressed the keys again, this time with more confidence. The first notes were soft and uneven, barely audible over the noise of the city. Passers-by glanced at him briefly but continued on their way. Some shook their heads, muttering under their breath about how strange it was to see a homeless man at a piano. Others slowed down a little, curious, wondering what he was doing. The man did not notice or care about their whispers. He focused only on the music, letting his fingers find their own path across the keys. As he played, the notes grew stronger and more confident. The melody was simple, but there was an honesty to it that could not be taught. A feeling that came from deep within his soul. A few people began to stop and listen. A mother with her young child paused, holding her child close as the man's music filled the air. An elderly man who had been sitting on a nearby bench feeding pigeons stood up and wiped a tear from his eye. The man's fingers danced over the piano keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone in his condition. The notes carried a story of hardship, of struggle, of quiet resilience, and people could feel it. They didn't need to know his life story to understand the emotion behind the music. Some took out their phones and started recording, not wanting to miss a moment of what was happening. Others simply stopped, mesmerized, letting the music wash over them. The homeless man closed his eyes as he played, forgetting for a moment the harshness of the world around him. He remembered sitting in a warm room years ago, the piano that had been his constant companion, practicing for hours, dreaming of a future filled with music. Life had taken a different turn, pushing him onto the streets, but the love for music had never left him. Playing now in the middle of the busy city, he felt a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. The crowd around him grew larger, though he remained unaware of it. People whispered to each other, amazed by his skill, wondering where he had learned to play so beautifully. The music seemed to touch everyone in a different way. Some felt nostalgia, some felt sorrow, and some felt hope. A young woman standing nearby couldn't help but smile as she watched him. She noticed the way his fingers moved effortlessly, how his body swayed slightly with the rhythm, and how his expression changed as he played. There was a story in every note, and she felt privileged to witness it. She whispered to her friend, telling them to listen closely, to really hear the music, because it was unlike anything she had ever heard in the city before. Others joined in the small circle of onlookers, drawn by the sound of the piano. People started leaving coins near his shoes, some clapping quietly after particularly beautiful phrases, others simply nodding in appreciation. The man played for what seemed like hours, though in reality it was only a short time. He played pieces from his memory, improvisations that flowed naturally from his heart. Each note carried a depth of feeling that could not be learned from books or lessons alone. His music told of loneliness and hope, of pain and perseverance, of dreams that refused to die, even when life was harsh. Passers-by, who had initially ignored him, now stopped in their tracks. mesmerized by the unexpected beauty coming from someone they would never have guessed could create such music. Children watched wide-eyed, some trying to imitate the notes on imaginary pianos, inspired by the sight before them. The atmosphere around the piano began to change. What had started as casual curiosity turned into something deeper. People were no longer just observing. They were feeling. The music seemed to lift the weight of the city's noise, replacing it with something pure and human. Conversations slowed, phones were lowered, and for a few moments, everyone present was united by the sound of the piano and the story it told. The homeless man, still unaware of the growing crowd, continued to play, lost in the rhythm and the emotion. Finding comfort in the connection his music was creating as the afternoon light began to fade, the man's fingers moved more confidently, and his melody became more intricate. Someone in the crowd whispered that they had never heard anything like this before, that it was as if the piano itself was alive, and the man was giving it a voice. The sound echoed through the square, drawing even more people from nearby streets. A street performer nearby stopped his own act to listen, nodding in admiration at the skill and feeling of the music. Even the busiest commuters slowed their steps, unable to resist the pull of the melody. By the time the sun began to set, the man had finished his piece. He opened his eyes and looked around, seeing the crowd that had gathered. People were clapping, some cheering softly, others with tears in their eyes. The man felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. For a moment, he forgot the struggles of his life, the hunger, the cold nights, the loneliness. In that moment, he was simply a musician, a storyteller, and someone who could touch hearts with his music. A few people approached him to offer food, blankets, and warm drinks, but he waved them away gently, not wanting anything. All he wanted was to keep playing, to keep sharing the music that had been his companion through so many difficult years. As the crowd slowly dispersed, some leaving messages on social media about the incredible pianist they had just seen, the man remained at the piano. He looked down at the keys, remembering the life he had left behind, and felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe people would see him not just as a homeless man, but as a musician with a story worth hearing. The city around him continued to move, people rushing past, but for a brief moment, time had stopped. And everyone who had listened had been changed in some small way. The music had reminded them of the beauty in the world, the power of human resilience, and the extraordinary talent that can exist in the most unexpected places. And so, the man sat there, fingers lightly touching the keys again, ready to play another melody, ready to let his music speak when words could not, unaware that the first notes he had played today were about to change everything. The music from the piano had started to attract more and more people. At first, they came out of curiosity, wondering who could make such beautiful sounds. But soon, it was clear that this was no ordinary street performance. The homeless man continued to play, and the notes seemed to flow effortlessly, as if they had been waiting inside him for years, ready to burst into the world. His hands moved with a natural rhythm, sometimes soft and gentle, sometimes strong and bold. Each note told a story of struggle, pain, hope, and resilience. The crowd began to notice something extraordinary. The music seemed to touch their hearts in a way that few things could. A woman who had been walking her dog stopped and listened. Her eyes widened as she watched the man's fingers glide across the keys. She could see the concentration on his face, the subtle movements of his body as he became one with the piano. There was an honesty in the music, a vulnerability that made it impossible to ignore. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she didn't understand exactly why. The music carried emotions that words could not capture. And for a moment she felt connected to the world in a way she hadn't in years. Nearby, a teenager holding a skateboard watched silently. He had been having a tough week, feeling invisible and overlooked by everyone around him. But now, as he listened to the piano, he felt something stir inside him, a feeling of calm, of hope, and of wonder. He realized that talent and beauty could exist in the most unexpected places, that sometimes the most important things were hidden in plain sight. He stayed for a long time, unable to tear himself away from the music, wanting to understand the story the man was telling without words. The man at the piano was unaware of the impact he was having. His mind was focused entirely on the music, on the melodies that came naturally to him. He remembered lessons from years ago, the hours he had spent practicing alone in a small, warm room, dreaming of one day performing for people who would listen and appreciate his music. Life had not been kind, and circumstances had forced him onto the streets, but the music had never left him. Now, in the open air of the city, with a growing crowd around him, felt a sense of freedom and purpose he hadn't felt in years. It was as if the piano had become an extension of himself, and through it, he could express everything he had endured. People began to gather more closely, forming a circle around the piano. They were no longer just spectators. They were participants in the moment. Some were quietly weeping, touched by the depth of the music. Others were smiling, remembering their own dreams and aspirations. A street musician who had been playing nearby put down his guitar and simply listened, amazed by the skill and emotion of the man at the piano. The notes seemed to rise above the noise of the city, cutting through the bustle of traffic, the chatter of people, and the distant hum of trains. For those few minutes, the world seemed to pause. Holding its breath in awe, a mother holding her young child in her arms whispered to her daughter to listen carefully. The child tilted her head, eyes wide, as the music wrapped around her like a warm blanket. She didn't understand every note or every rhythm, but she felt the emotions, the story, and the beauty of it all. Her mother smiled, realizing that this was a rare gift, something that could stay with her daughter forever. Around them, other families had stopped to watch. Children pointing excitedly at the man, adults exchanging glances of amazement and admiration. The homeless man began to play a melody he had composed himself, one that reflected the years of hardship and loneliness he had endured. Each note carried memories of cold nights, empty stomachs, and the constant struggle to survive. But within the melody, there was also hope, resilience, and a quiet determination to keep going despite the odds. The crowd was mesmerized, sensing the depth of his life experience woven into the music. Some people whispered to each other, wondering how someone who had lived such a difficult life could create something so beautiful and moving. As the music continued, more people began to stop by. A businessman walking to a meeting paused, watching for several minutes before checking his watch and silently shaking his head in disbelief. A young couple on their way to dinner lingered, unable to tear themselves away from the sound. Even a few tourists, who had been exploring the city and taking photos, stopped and listened, amazed at the unexpected performance. The man at the piano seemed to have created a magnetic force, drawing people in not with words or flashy tricks, but with pure, heartfelt music. A photographer who had been passing by took several pictures, capturing the expressions of the crowd as well as the intensity and focus of the pianist. She realized that this moment was special, something she would want to share with the world. It was rare to see such talent combined with such raw emotion, especially from someone whom society had largely ignored. The images she captured would later accompany articles and posts online, helping to spread the story far beyond the city square. The man's music began to take on a more lively and playful tone. He improvised a few lighter, joyful pieces, causing some in the crowd to smile and even clap along quietly. It was a reminder that despite the hardships he had faced, he still carried joy and creativity within him. The contrast between the sorrowful melodies and the uplifting tunes made the performance even more powerful. People could feel the full spectrum of human experience in the music, from pain to hope, from struggle to triumph, as the afternoon wore on. The man paused for a moment, looking around at the crowd that had formed. He noticed people of all ages and backgrounds, united by the music. There were students, office workers, children, and elderly people, all sharing a common experience. Some had come for just a few minutes and stayed for nearly an hour, captivated by the skill and emotion of the pianist. The man felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that even in his current situation, he could make a difference, however small. In the lives of those who listened, the crowd began to leave small gifts of food, drinks, and even coins, though the man politely declined most of them. He wasn't playing for money. He was playing because he loved music and because he needed to express himself. The generosity and encouragement of strangers, however, warmed his heart. It reminded him that people were capable of kindness, even in a world that often seemed harsh and uncaring. Some people stayed behind to talk to him, asking about his life, complimenting his talent and encouraging him to keep playing. Each interaction was a small affirmation, a reassurance that his music mattered. The man closed his eyes again and resumed playing, feeling more confident and alive than he had in years. He began to explore more complex melodies, allowing his emotions to guide his fingers. The crowd responded, leaning in to listen, moved by the honesty and beauty of each note. It was clear that this performance was more than just music. It was a connection between the pianist and everyone present, a shared human experience that transcended words. Some people whispered about how extraordinary it was to witness such talent coming from someone society had largely ignored. Others simply sat quietly, absorbing the music and letting it speak to them. A young musician in the crowd, carrying a small violin, felt inspired. She had been struggling with her own self-doubt and fear of performing in public. But seeing the homeless man play with such confidence and emotion gave her courage. She realized that talent and passion could shine through even the most difficult circumstances, and that true art comes from the heart. She quietly watched, learning from his example, and felt a renewed determination to pursue her own dreams. The man played until the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the square. The city lights started to flicker on, illuminating the faces of those still gathered. People clapped, cheered, and whispered their admiration, reluctant to leave even as the day turned to evening. The music had created a moment of unity, of shared emotion, and of pure human connection. The homeless man, despite the hardships he faced, had reminded everyone present of the power of art, the strength of the human spirit, and the beauty that can exist even in unexpected places. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the man remained at the piano, taking a deep breath and reflecting on the day. He felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had touched people's hearts with his music. Though he returned to the streets that night, he carried with him a renewed hope, a sense of purpose, and the knowledge that his music could reach people in ways nothing else could. The city would move on, the streets would continue to be busy and noisy, but the echoes of the piano, the emotions it carried, and the connections it created would linger long after he had left. And so, as darkness fell and the city lights twinkled, the homeless man sat quietly at the piano, fingers resting gently on the keys, ready for another day, another melody, and another opportunity to touch the hearts of those who were willing to listen. The next day, the city woke up like it always did, busy and loud, unaware that something special had already begun to grow. But for some people, the memory of the homeless man and his piano had not faded overnight. Short videos from the previous day were now spreading across phones and screens. People shared them with friends, family, and coworkers, adding simple captions about an unexpected pianist who had touched their hearts. The clips were shaky and unpolished, but the music was clear and the emotion was impossible to miss. Comments began to appear, full of surprise, admiration, and questions. Who was this man? Where did he learn to play like that? How could someone living on the streets have such deep talent? By late morning, a small crowd had already gathered near the piano again. Some were there by chance, but many came on purpose, hoping to see the man return. A few carried coffee cups and warm food just in case he showed up. Others came with quiet curiosity, wanting to witness with their own eyes what they had seen online. The piano sat silently for a while, reflecting the sky above it, as if waiting. When the homeless man finally appeared, walking slowly with his familiar tired steps, a few people recognized him right away. They whispered to each other and smiled. He noticed the attention, but didn't fully understand why people were looking at him differently today. To him, it was just another day of surviving, another day of moving from place to place. Still, something inside him felt lighter, as if yesterday had opened a small door he didn't know existed. He approached the piano again, unsure if he should sit down. A moment of doubt crossed his face. He wasn't used to being watched with kindness or expectation. But then he remembered the feeling from the day before, the warmth in his chest, the way the music had made him feel alive. He sat down and placed his hands on the keys. This time, He didn't hesitate. He began to play. The sound carried across the square, and people stopped almost instantly. The music felt deeper today, stronger, as if the man was no longer just releasing memories, but also hope. His fingers moved with confidence, and his body leaned into the piano, fully present in the moment. The crowd grew quickly. Some people clapped softly along with the rhythm. Others stood still, eyes closed, letting the music wash over them. A woman who worked nearby stepped out during her break and froze when she heard the melody. She had seen the video the night before and never imagined she would hear the music live. Standing there, she felt the same emotions rise again, only stronger this time. She noticed how the man's clothes were still worn, how his hands were rough, yet how gently he touched the keys. The contrast made the moment even more powerful. As the man played, memories surfaced again, but now they came with less pain. He remembered not only the loss, but also the love he once had for music. The joy of learning, the pride of mastering difficult pieces. He remembered people who had encouraged him long ago, voices he hadn't thought of in years. For the first time in a long while, those memories didn't hurt. They felt like reminders of who he still was. More people began recording, but this time they stayed longer. They didn't just capture a few seconds. They listened. Some put their phones down entirely, choosing to be fully present. A few strangers exchanged quiet words about how rare moments like this were. The city felt different, softer, as if the music had changed the air itself. A local reporter arrived, guided by messages and shared clips. Instead of pushing forward loudly, the reporter stood at the edge of the crowd, listening first. It was clear that this was not a story to rush. When the man finished one piece and paused, the crowd applauded openly. The sound startled him. He looked up, eyes wide, almost unsure how to react. He gave a small nod, embarrassed but grateful. The reporter approached carefully and asked a few gentle questions during a break. The man spoke quietly, choosing his words with care. He didn't go into every detail of his past. He only said that music had always been part of his life, and that the streets had not taken that away from him. His voice was calm, without bitterness, and that alone seemed to move people even more. As the day went on, the crowd stayed. Some people left and came back with friends. Others brought food and warm drinks, placing them nearby without forcing anything on him. The man accepted a cup of water and nodded in thanks. He was not used to so much attention, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt respectful. He played different kinds of music that day. Some pieces were slow and thoughtful. Others were brighter, almost playful. Each one showed a different side of him, a fuller picture of a man shaped by both hardship and hope. Children sat on the ground near the piano, listening closely. An elderly couple held hands, swaying gently to the sound at one point. A passerby asked quietly where he had learned to play like that. The man smiled faintly and said that life had been his teacher for a long time. That simple answer stayed with many who heard it. It felt honest and true. As afternoon turned to evening, the crowd did not thin the way it usually did. People seemed reluctant to leave, as if stepping away would break something fragile and beautiful. The man felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired. His fingers ached slightly, yet he didn't want to stop. He knew moments like this didn't come often. Another short video from that day was already gaining attention online, shared by someone in the crowd. Comments poured in faster than before. People from other places asked where the piano was, saying they wanted to come and listen themselves. Some shared their own stories of struggle and how the music gave them comfort. The man did not know any of this yet. But the ripple he had started was growing when he finally stood up and stepped away from the piano. The crowd applauded again, louder this time. A few people thanked him directly, telling him how much the music meant to them. He listened quietly, nodding, not knowing how to respond. Words felt small compared to what he had expressed through sound. As he walked away that evening, carrying a small bag of food someone had given him, he felt something unfamiliar but welcome. It was a sense of being seen, not judged, not ignored, just seen. The streets were still hard, and his life had not magically changed overnight. But inside him, something had shifted. He knew now that the piano was more than an instrument placed in a public square. It was a bridge. It connected him to people, to his past, and to a future he had almost stopped believing in. And as the city lights flickered on once again, the man walked into the night with a quiet belief that this story was not over yet. Not even close. The following morning, the square seemed different. People talked about the homeless man at the piano as if he had become part of the city itself. Word had spread overnight. Short videos and messages shared across social media had drawn attention from far beyond the neighborhood. Curious strangers walked toward the square, hoping to see the pianist they had heard about online. Some had come from nearby streets, while others had traveled farther, drawn by a story that felt real, simple, and extraordinary all at once. By late morning, a small crowd had already gathered. People exchanged quiet whispers, excited and hesitant at the same time. Some brought coffee or pastries, hoping the man might accept them, while others simply stood, holding their phones but keeping them tucked away, wanting to be fully present for the moment. The piano sat as it had for days, polished and unassuming, waiting to be awakened once again. When the homeless man appeared, he noticed the crowd immediately. A slight tension ran through him, a mix of nerves and curiosity. He had played here before, but never with this many strangers looking at him with interest rather than indifference. He walked slowly to the piano, acknowledging a few familiar faces with a small nod. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the keys, but once the first note sounded, all doubt seemed to vanish. The music began quietly, tentative at first, but it grew quickly. The homeless man's fingers moved with a confidence and grace that surprised even him. Each note seemed to tell a story of its own, blending memories of hardship with hope for the future. People stopped in their tracks. Commuters, tourists, and locals alike all found themselves pulled in by the depth and honesty of the music. There was no performance in the usual sense. It was not rehearsed for applause or fame. It was pure, human expression. Among the crowd, a man with a camera watched silently. He was a local music producer, someone who spent years listening to talent and discovering hidden artists. He had been walking to a meeting when he heard the music and instinctively followed it. As the homeless man played, he realized the uniqueness of what he was witnessing. This was not just skill, it was soul. It was impossible to ignore the intensity and emotion behind every chord. He knew that this moment could not be kept to himself. The music shifted, moving from slow, melancholic tones to lighter, more hopeful melodies. The crowd responded, clapping softly along with the rhythm, some humming quietly, others simply closing their eyes, letting the music fill their thoughts. The homeless man, feeling the presence of so many listeners, allowed himself to fully inhabit the sound. He improvised freely, letting emotion guide his hands as he had done countless times before when no one was watching. Only now, for the first time, the music had an audience that seemed to understand without explanation. The producer stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance. He watched how the man's fingers danced across the keys, how his body moved naturally with the music, how his face reflected every feeling the notes carried. The producer whispered to himself that this man's talent was rare, something that could not be taught. He knew that with guidance and opportunity, the homeless man could perform in ways that would touch even more hearts. A small child in the crowd tugged at their parent's hand, its pointing at the pianist. The child's eyes were wide with wonder, captivated by the sound and by the man himself. The parents smiled, feeling something they hadn't felt in years. Awe, hope, and the reminder that beauty could appear in the most unexpected places. Around them, others nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears, others simply smiling quietly. The music had become more than notes. It was a bridge connecting strangers, dissolving the walls that separated them as the afternoon continued. People approached the man, offering small gestures of kindness. Warm drinks, food, and even blankets appeared nearby. He accepted some, but most he politely declined, not wanting to be treated with pity. His purpose was not the attention or the gifts. It was the music itself. And yet, the generosity of strangers reinforced something that he had almost forgotten, that even in a harsh world, people could be good and caring. The music took a different turn, more dynamic, more expressive. It told of struggle and survival, of the long nights on the streets and the dreams that had never truly faded. The homeless man poured all his experiences into the performance, letting every note speak of resilience. The crowd leaned in, hanging on to each sound, each pause, each flourish of emotion. They were captivated not just by the skill, but by the story woven through the music. Some whispered to each other, expressing disbelief and admiration, while others simply absorbed the moment silently. The producer decided he could no longer wait. Carefully, he approached the man and spoke softly, making sure not to interrupt the flow of music. He introduced himself and explained that he worked in the music industry. He offered an opportunity training, guidance, and a chance to perform on bigger stages. The homeless man listened, surprised and cautious. He had never imagined that someone would see him as more than a street performer. The idea felt almost unreal, but there was a flicker of hope in his chest that had been growing over the past. A few days, the crowd around them began to notice the exchange. They whispered excitedly, understanding the significance of the moment. People began clapping quietly, encouraging him without pressuring him. The homeless man paused, taking a deep breath, and then nodded slowly. He accepted the offer, a quiet smile spreading across his face. It was a step into something new, a bridge from the streets to a world of opportunity that he had once dreamed of, but thought he had lost forever. As word of the offer spread, more people gathered. Some had come just to hear him play, but now they stayed to witness this turning point in his life. A sense of joy and anticipation filled the square. The music continued, but now it carried a different energy. It was not only a reflection of the past, but also a celebration of what could be possible in the future. Every note seemed lighter, brighter, and filled with a cautious optimism that the crowd could feel. By evening, the square had transformed into a place of quiet reverence. People left slowly, reluctant to step away from the magic they had witnessed. Some took photos or recorded videos, others simply remembered the scene in their minds, knowing they had experienced something extraordinary. The homeless man, exhausted but full of a new energy, finally stood up and acknowledged the crowd with a small wave. There was no need for words. Everyone understood the significance of what had just happened. That night, he returned to the small corner where he slept. But he did not feel the same hopelessness that usually accompanied the streets. Instead, he felt a quiet determination, a sense that the next chapter of his life was beginning. He thought about the piano, the music, and the people who had listened. And he realized that he had discovered a way to connect, to matter, and to create beauty, even in the midst of hardship. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the streets. In the days that followed, the homeless man began to prepare for the opportunities that had been offered to him. The producer helped him connect with instructors and venues. Small performances were scheduled, each one a chance to grow, to refine his skill, and to reach new audiences. Every day he returned to the piano in the square for a few hours, playing for the passers-by who had become his temporary audience. But now he did so with purpose and awareness of the path ahead. The city itself seemed to embrace him. People he had never met smiled and waved. Some stopped to say hello and tell him how much the music had touched them. He began to realize that his talent, once hidden and ignored, had the power to change not just his life, but also the lives of those who heard it. And so, the homeless man at the piano, who had once been overlooked, began a journey that would take him far beyond the square. Guided by the music that had always been his true companion, the day had finally arrived. After weeks of preparing, practicing, and meeting with instructors, the homeless man was about to perform on a stage much larger than the small square where he had first played. He woke early, the sunlight spilling gently through the windows of the small apartment he now rented temporarily, a place given to him by the producer who believed in his talent. The apartment was modest, but it had warmth, a bed, and most importantly, space for him to focus on the music that had carried him through so many years. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel the cold or the hunger of the streets. Instead, he felt anticipation, nervousness, and a quiet excitement. He sat at a small practice piano in the corner, letting his fingers run over the keys, feeling the familiar flow of sound. Each note reminded him of the journey that had brought him here at the cold streets. The polished public piano, the curious strangers, and the moment when someone finally saw him not as a homeless man, but as a musician. He took a deep breath and remembered the eyes of the crowd in the square, the warmth of their attention, and the hope that had begun to grow inside him. That hope was what he carried with him now. The performance hall was buzzing with quiet excitement. People filled the seats, whispering and looking around in anticipation. The stage was set simply, with a single grand piano in the center. Behind the curtains, the homeless man felt a flutter of nerves. This was a space filled with strangers, and unlike the square, this was not a casual gathering. Every eye in the hall would be on him, expecting something extraordinary. He reminded himself that the music was his own, that it had always been about expression, and that if he played with honesty, the audience would hear the story he carried as he walked onto the stage. The lights brightened, and the audience fell silent. He paused for a moment, taking in the sight of so many people gathered to listen. For a second, he felt small and unsure, but then he remembered the piano in the square, the encouragement from strangers, and the journey that had led him here. He smiled slightly and sat down at the grand piano. His hands hovered over the keys, and for a brief moment, there was silence, the kind that felt heavy with expectation. Then he pressed the first key. A single, clear note rang out, cutting through the quiet. It was followed by another, then another, until the melody began to flow naturally. The music filled the hall, wrapping around every listener, drawing them in. Each note carried his history, his struggles, his hope, and his dreams. He did not rush, nor did he force the sound. He let it move at its own pace, letting the emotion guide his fingers. People in the audience were captivated. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others leaned forward in their seats, unable to look away from the pianist, fascinated by the story he told without words. A few whispered to each other, commenting on the beauty, the depth, and the unexpected brilliance of the performance. The homeless man played on, oblivious to everything but the music, as if he had been born to this moment. The melody shifted, carrying both sorrow and joy, moments of silence interspersed with bursts of sound. He played compositions he had created in the square, refined and expanded, and improvisations that reflected his emotions at that very moment. Every chord was deliberate, every pause meaningful. The audience felt every note, every breath, every emotion, as if he were speaking directly to them through the piano in the back of the hall. The producer watched with a quiet smile, remembering the first time he had heard the man play in the square. He had seen potential then, but he had not imagined the full depth of emotion and skill he was witnessing now. The transformation was remarkable, not just in the music, but in the man himself. There was confidence, presence, and a quiet pride in the way he played. The streets that had once been his entire world were now a memory, and the stage was his new space. Halfway through the performance, the homeless man played a piece that was deeply personal. It was slower, more contemplative, with long, flowing notes that seemed to hang in the air. He thought of the nights spent alone, the cold, the hunger, and the uncertainty of life. But within the music, he also expressed resilience, hope, and the unbroken spirit that had carried him this far. Some in the audience felt tears form in their eyes. Others sat silently, holding on to the moment, understanding the depth of human experience that had been conveyed without a single word as he continued. The energy of the music shifted. It became lighter, more uplifting, full of promise and anticipation. The man allowed himself to smile subtly as he played, feeling joy in the sound he created. The audience responded unconsciously, leaning into the rhythm, some clapping softly along with the flow, though mostly just letting the music fill their senses. The performance was no longer just about technique or skill. It was about connection, and every person in the hall felt it deeply. When the final note faded into silence, the room held its breath for a moment, suspended in awe. Then the applause began, soft at first, then growing louder and louder until it became a roar. People stood, some with tears in their eyes, some smiling broadly, all expressing their appreciation for the journey they had witnessed and the talent they had been privileged to experience. The homeless man looked up, overwhelmed but grateful. He had never imagined such a response, and yet it felt like a natural continuation of the moments he had experienced in the square. The small gestures of kindness and the music that had always been with him. The producer stepped onto the stage, clapping and smiling, and the man finally allowed himself a bow. The applause continued, echoing through the hall, filling every corner with recognition and respect. People approached after the performance, shaking his hand, offering congratulations, and expressing admiration for both his skill and his story. He accepted their words humbly, feeling the difference between admiration and pity. This recognition was not about sympathy, it was about talent, courage, and the power of persistence. After the performance, he was invited to speak briefly. He addressed the audience quietly, thanking them for listening and sharing the moment with him. He spoke of music as a companion through life's hardships, a language that could convey what words often could not. He did not dwell on the past or on the hardships he had faced. Instead, he focused on gratitude, hope, and the belief that beauty could exist anywhere, if one was willing to look for it and nurture it. In the following days, the story of the homeless man's performance spread far and wide. Newspapers, blogs, and social media shared the tale of his journey from the streets to the stage. People were inspired not just by his talent, but by his resilience, humility, and authenticity. He received invitations to perform in other cities, to collaborate with musicians, and to teach others who struggled, just as he had once struggled. The piano that had been his companion on the streets had led him to opportunities beyond his imagination. Despite all the attention, he remained grounded. He continued to practice, to create music, and to remember the journey that had brought him here. He returned occasionally to the square, where it all began, playing for passers-by, children, and those who had first believed in him. The music there felt different, intimate, and personal, a reminder that the path from hardship to recognition had not erased his roots in time. The homeless man became more than a performer. He became a symbol of hope. People spoke of him as proof that talent could not be ignored, that resilience could overcome circumstances, that the human spirit could shine even in the darkest times. He inspired others to follow their passions, to keep trying when life seemed impossible, and to recognize the beauty in unexpected places. As he played each day, whether on stage or in the square, he carried the memory of every listener, every gesture of kindness, and every moment that had led him here. And though his life had changed dramatically, he never forgot the power of a single note, a single moment, or a single person believing in him. His journey from the streets to the stage was complete. Yet it was also just the beginning, a story that would continue to unfold with every melody, every performance, and every heart touched by his music.